I am Richard Feldman, Associate Professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. I wish to thank the Vice President, Tom Wormuth, and the Office of Academic Affairs for supporting the superb fall lecture series that we're having, and I want to remind you of a few upcoming lectures. Tomorrow in this very room, again at 7 p.m., is the Handel Chrome lecture by Susanna Shaw-Romney of NYU, speaking from her book, New Netherland Connections, Intimate Networks, and Atlantic Ties in 17th Century America. The following Monday, also at 7 p.m., October 22nd, in the Fusco Recital Hall, starting out our Sustainability Week events, the keynote lecture will be by Don McLaughlin, a professional engineer of Alara Engineering in Chicago. He'll be speaking about energy conservation and other campus sustainability issues. Wednesday, November 7th, 6:30 in Hancock, 2023, is Changing Views of Hamilton's Place in U.S. History by Richard Seila, also of NYU. I'd also like to thank Dean of Science Alicia Slater and the School of Science for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture. And I thank and welcome all of you for taking the time to come tonight and to listen. On January 25th, I received an email from somebody I did not know who described a book on the global spread of tick-borne illnesses and the links to climate change. As a field biologist and as a resident in a rural community where I frequently come in contact with ticks, I was intrigued. As a teacher of climate change, furthermore, I was also intrigued by this linkage. The writer was also direct, stating, "My book is an excellent example of science that has been made understandable and engaging." I can validate this claim because after receiving the book, it quickly moved to the top of my summer reading list. I just could not read it before going to bed. The reasons will become clear. Booklist recently called it superbly written and researched. By the way, you may purchase your own copy of the book after tonight's lecture right outside the Goletti Theater for just $15. Second, the writer also asked, perhaps my book could be the subject of a talk at Marist College. Before agreeing to pursue this request, I wanted to meet the writer, which happened 3 weeks later. From that engaging discussion, it became clear that indeed Mary Beth Pfeiffer should return to her alma mater to speak to us. Even though I had been paying attention to ticks and tick-borne illnesses for a good 30 years, I was not prepared for the disturbing information that Mary Beth lays out in her book. It has changed the way I prepare myself and others to be outside, and has shifted my attitudes towards the medical profession and other institutions who need to address tick-borne illnesses more aggressively. Tonight's lecture may do the same for you. Mary Beth Pfeiffer, welcome back to Marist College.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Because I have one of these non-attached things on. It's great to be here. It feels a little bit like coming home because I did graduate from Marist many moons ago. I also returned to Poughkeepsie 6 years after graduation to work at the Poughkeepsie Journal, where I worked for about 30 years and where I cut my teeth as an investigative reporter. It all started here at Marist. And then I went and took all I learned here in all of 2 journalism courses, because that's all they offered back then in journalism, and put it to good use. So as I said, I was an investigative reporter, and I had worked at the Poughkeepsie Journal for about 30 years. And it took me a long time to get around to looking into Lyme disease. You know, investigative reporters, we look for things like corruption, scandal, waste of taxpayer dollars, abuse of power. We look at how, you know, systems of government, of public institutions, basically don't work. We tell the bad news. It's our bread and butter. But I didn't think I would find those things with Lyme disease. I had heard one or two horror stories. Surely, if you live here long enough, you're going to hear those stories. But I thought they were the aberration. I thought they were outside of the norm. I thought you got a rash, you got antibiotics, you got better. I, like many people, had a false, or probably better put, incomplete view of Lyme disease. So I first presented all that in a series of articles in the Poughkeepsie Journal that started with this. And this sort of shows why we're all here right now, and why we ought to care about this. Dutchess leads nation in Lyme. At that point, I had looked at data for every county in the United States. Columbia was first, Dutchess was second in terms of Lyme disease at that point. So we'll get into a little bit about those problems with Lyme disease in a second, but first, a little story. A while back, Bill Gates was giving a talk on malaria. The disease, which is delivered by mosquitoes, kills 500,000 people a year, he said. So with that, Gates walked over to a table, unscrewed a jar, and out flew a tiny cloud of mosquitoes. No reason only poor people should have the experience, he said. There was a bit of a response in the audience, you know, people are like, I often say if ticks could fly, Lyme disease and ticks would get the attention they deserve. You might recall the uproar at the, around the time of the Summer Olympics in 2016 in Brazil. The Zika virus erupted then. It's from mosquitoes. It's very serious. It can cause birth defects. But then Zika hopped from South America to Florida. Within months, Congress put up $1.1 billion to fight Zika. Ticks have never impressed Congress in this way, ever. That same year, the US government spent $30 million on Lyme disease, which basically hasn't changed for about 10 years or so. That little sliver all the way to the right shows per patient spending for Lyme disease. My goal is to change the way ticks are viewed in the public imagination. That said, I have a jar here. Can you guess what's in it? Now, I interviewed a scientist at Bard College. She has such a great name for these things that it's the title of one of my chapters. She calls them tiny armored tanks. You get a mosquito on you, you go like that and you squish it. Has anybody ever tried doing that with a tick? It's like they're impossible to kill. So, what do you think? Should I? There's two ways to think about this. On the one hand, these things crawl about 2 feet, 2 to 3 feet in their entire lives. So, maybe a week before they got to the third row. On the other, though, who knows what's in them? These little creatures were laboratory raised for research, but the scientists who gave them to me said, please, don't take any chances. Don't let them loose. So, I don't intend to do so, not now, not ever. So, I'm going to put these babies to bed. So, I just have to show you. This is what it looks like. I have actually 2 vials. One of black-legged ticks, that skinny one, and a little jar of dog ticks. which give you Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Okay, so I'm here to paint the big picture of Lyme disease, the one my book is all about, the one that combines what's going on in our warmer, developed world where climate change is real, with what's going on in physicians' offices and in their patients' knees and hearts and brains and bodies. These two trends, the environmental and the medical, are very much connected. First, a picture. This is me in about 1988, a much more innocent time, up to my knees in tall grass, holding a baby. Do you think I would do that today? No. We are seeing an explosion of these tiny 8-legged tanks. They're in our Pachysandra patches. They're at the edges of our schoolyards, our kids' ball fields. They're along our nature trails. This is relatively new. Who remembers walking a dog in the 1980s or 90s and coming back with a dozen ticks on them? I actually had that happen the day after Christmas a couple of years ago. 4 dogs, a 10-minute walk, 21 ticks. This is in winter. All ticks need, basically, by the way, is a blast of balmy air, maybe 40 degrees, 45 degrees. If there's no snow, no ice, they climb right out of the dirt, the leaf litter, and up they go. They don't walk this way so well, but they're really good at climbing and wading. Ticks that carry Lyme disease are in twice as many US counties now as 20 years ago. So, okay. This is where we get to the gloomy slide. We went from happy, sun is out. This is a field I've looked at for 36 years. It's behind my home. I have a different relationship with it today than I did back then. It's still beautiful, but now we have to look at nature with another emotion, fear. So the second trend, the ticks, now the medical trend, is, of course, the diseases those ticks carry. We have a lot to learn on how to diagnose and treat them, Lyme disease in particular. The test isn't good. The treatments are fine, but only if you're fortunate enough to be diagnosed early, to have a clear-cut case. But when you don't see the rash, or you fail the test, when Lyme advances or it comes with another tick-borne illness or two, all bets are off. Moreover, and this is the real tragedy and why I wrote my book, doctors have been discouraged from treating complex cases of tick-borne disease. They see claims denied by insurance companies. They see colleagues disparaged. My own doctor told me a prominent Lyme physician was, quote, full of shit. They see doctors fined or disciplined who step outside the lines of how you're supposed to treat Lyme disease. Now, this is a savvy crowd, I think. I suspect, because of where you live, because of where you are right now, that you know a thing or two about ticks. That many of you, how many have been bitten? Yeah, about half, I'd say. I even expected more. I also suspect you've probably heard stories about what this illness can do to people, to children. You may have experienced this yourself. I wrote my book for you, for children yet to be bitten. I wrote it because of the huge health challenge that we have yet to confront caused by ticks. Okay, let's first talk about that first trend, the movement of ticks. In my book, I talk about moose. It's one of the most excerpted and for many people memorable parts of the book, unfortunately. In Maine, in New Hampshire, in Minnesota, moose are being found with 100,000 to 150,000 ticks on them. The moose try and rid themselves of the ticks by rubbing against trees, losing fur in the process. Their grayish skin pokes through. They're called ghost moose. They have so many ticks that when a new calf is birthed, ticks move from mama to newborn in a heartbeat. Now, moose don't get Lyme disease. They don't carry black-legged ticks, the kind that we have here, and that do carry Lyme disease. But what's happening to moose is a tiny sliver of what's going on in our changed and warmer world, where winters are shorter, snow cover is thinner. Moose are falling prey, not to wolves or parasites that have long been in their bodies and have preyed on them, but to ticks. Ticks that are taking half their blood. Okay, so it's not a very good time to be a moose. It is a very good time to be a tick. In my title, I call Lyme disease the first epidemic of climate change. There is right now an army of ticks. Ticks by the billion moving around the planet. Lyme disease isn't just in the Northeast or Midwest or the Mid-Hudson Valley. As an aside, in Dutchess County right now, the adult ticks are out. This is adult tick season. This is when you more or less can see them, as opposed to in the spring when they're about as big as the tip of a ballpoint pen. Half of those adult ticks carry Lyme disease. 12% carry another bug called anaplasma. Causes nasty fever, severe headache, chills, can last for weeks. 8% have babesia, which causes a disease a lot like malaria. The figures are for about the same for Ulster County, where I live. But we are not alone. I'm going to read you a sentence. Underdiagnosis of early Lyme disease and physical damage at an advanced stage are a huge problem. That was written by a scientist in China, where infected ticks are in many provinces, where 5% of the residents of a suburb of Beijing have evidence of Lyme disease in their bodies. Lyme disease is in Ireland, the UK, Scandinavia, France, and Eastern Europe. It's doubling and tripling every year in Russia, even Siberia and Mongolia. In Australia, an emergency room doctor told me he removes 200 ticks from individual patients all the time. These are some warning signs for ticks. Germany, France, in Paris parks, you will see this sign. The Netherlands, Australia. So this may sound a bit like a Stephen King novel, which is how a scientist who read my book described it. The only problem is it's not fiction. So, how and why is this happening? A few years ago, a group of scientists captured 3,000 birds as they entered the US from the south. This is why I love scientists. They do things like this. They counted ticks around the eyes and in the feathers of those birds. And then they did a little bit of math. They figured that the birds imported up to 39 million ticks a year. That's on one migratory flyway. We have 4 flyways in the Americas, and there's a lot more around the world. Now, ticks have been around for millions of years, and so has Lyme disease. This is where I get to use the pointer. Okay. This, on your left, is a tick encased in amber. You'll recall Jurassic Park and the mosquito, okay? Oh yeah, that's the mouth parts at the top, and this is its legs. And it was found about 20 years ago by a scientist who cut up the amber, estimated that it's 15 to 20 million years old, put it under a powerful microscope, and found on the right side what is the earliest evidence of Lyme disease, coiled bacteria. So we know that they've been around for a long time and that a warmer world did not invent Lyme disease. By the same token, ticks have also hitched rides on birds for thousands of years. But here's the thing. In the past, an imported tick generally didn't live very long at the far reaches of its journey. But today, when a migrating bird picks a tick up, say in South America or Central America or Virginia even, drops it in Nova Scotia, that tick is a pilgrim in a welcoming world. Temperatures in Canada have gone up 3 degrees in the 20th century. Winters are shorter. Growing seasons are longer. There's generally more humidity too, which ticks need and love. They need to stay moist. I have to put a couple of drops of water into my jar every couple of weeks. Keep the ticks going. By the way, they only feed 3 times in their entire lives, so they can go hundreds of days without eating. So anyway, on these migratory pathways, ticks are crossing seas this way. They're climbing latitudes. We have old data that show where they once lived and new data on where they live now. In 1958, a Bosnian scientist climbed an Alp. He wanted to see how high up ticks could live. Another reason I love scientists. He found them living at 800 meters. 40 years later, another scientist goes back, finds them at 1,200 meters. Science is telling us that ticks live where they once could not. Now, of note here, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is not doing much to live up to its name these days. But in 2014, it did something very interesting and surprising. It began to monitor Lyme disease as a measure of climate change. In other words, more cases meant more ticks, meant more warming. It's the only disease that the government tracks to measure climate change. This explosion of ticks is a huge change, as I said, from 30 years ago. But it's not just a warmer world. It's how and where we live. We live in a world of broken up forests, too many deer, deer that have lots of gardens to munch on, and no natural predators. A deer is where a female tick meets the love of her life and rides off into the sunset. Then, when her 2,000 babies hatch, they feast on lots of fat, happy mice. That, incidentally, are loaded with the Lyme disease bug. Foxes that might have eaten those mice aren't so common anymore. And so the cycle begins. All we have to do is step into the weeds. The climate, the bird, the deer, the mouse, the tick, the bug. They've done the rest. We have a perfect storm of a warmer, adulterated, and unbalanced world, and it is feeding a scourge of ticks. Now, onto that other trend. All this wouldn't be so bad if ticks could be controlled, if we had a vaccine against them, which is what I'd like to see, a vaccine against ticks, not against Lyme disease, because there's so many other things in ticks. Cesspools of infection. It wouldn't be so bad if American medicine and government had done what it did when the AIDS epidemic emerged. The 2 pathogens, the AIDS virus and the bacterium that causes Lyme disease, were identified within 2 years of each other in the early 1980s. But that's where the similarity diverges. For AIDS, for HIV, American medicine and government took a couple of years, but it geared up. It founded PhD programs. It built laboratories. It spent the money, and it found answers. The Lyme organism has not impressed Congress in this way in terms of spending money. Now, you might think that the two diseases aren't comparable because, frankly, Lyme patients aren't dying by the score, at least not that we know of or record, and that's a significant qualifier. People die when Lyme spirochetes go to the heart. That happened in 2013 to a 17-year-old boy from Poughkeepsie who had spent a couple of weeks at summer camp in Rhode Island. He tested negative on a Lyme test. It happened to a 38-year-old man in Dutchess County 5 months later. Many other cases of what we call Lyme carditis likely go undiagnosed, or at least uncounted. Lyme patients also die by suicide. The Lyme disease spirochete can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause dementia. The World Health Organization recently met and added Lyme dementia to its list of diagnostic codes. Stroke has been associated with Lyme disease. The quality of life of late-stage Lyme patients has been likened to congestive heart failure, diabetes, depression, and rheumatoid arthritis. This is a disease that has been underestimated. Instead, a kind of folklore has built up around Lyme disease. It's been repeated in medical journals and hailed by the US Centers for Disease Control. It goes like this. We know how to diagnose Lyme disease. We know how to treat. We know how to cure. Not to worry. The bigger epidemic, a prominent physician pronounced years ago, is Lyme anxiety. I talk in my book about a young boy named Troy. Troy is an adorable kid. He has thick blonde hair. He loved to do these bebop dances for his 4 older brothers. When he was 10, he was diagnosed with Lyme disease and treated briefly. Then a few weeks later, he got very sick. He lost 15 pounds. He weighed 75 pounds to begin with. He had trouble getting out of bed. He had fevers, headaches. He dragged his foot behind him, which is a known symptom of Lyme disease. When he was admitted to the hospital, the notes in his chart said he was, quote, uncomfortable, consistently crying, reporting constant pain. After 8 days in the hospital, doctors had an answer. They diagnosed Troy with something called pain amplification syndrome. One doctor said he was suffering from schoolitis. It was in his head, they concluded. They gave him antidepressants, told him to do breathing exercises, get up out of bed at the same time every day. Now, I read Troy's records. There were about 80 pages of them from when he was in the hospital. Many tests were done, as you would imagine, but doctors didn't pursue Lyme disease or any other tick-borne disease for that matter. His mother tried to tell them he had had Lyme disease. Quote, they never wanted to hear another thing about it. I've heard many stories like this. In Australia, a woman told me that when she brings her very ill daughter to an emergency room, she never uses the word Lyme. It's just too controversial. Now, Troy's story happened pretty recently in 2016, but moreover, it happened in Connecticut, the state where Lyme disease was discovered, where it's common, where it's supposedly known. But there, and in many other places, doctors are prepared only to treat Lyme disease when it's clear-cut, straightforward, curable. What Troy had, to them, didn't fit into the American image of Lyme disease. This is the fallacy of our fixed and dogmatic view of Lyme disease, and it has hampered doctors from helping patients. One of the things I discovered was the lengths to which people had to go to get care for late-stage Lyme disease. Here, they travel far and wide when they can't find treatment at home. But it doesn't just happen in the US. Because of the influence of American medicine, which is respected around the world, it happens in many other countries. When I went to England, I interviewed a man who flew to California to get care for Lyme disease. I spoke to a Swedish woman who had come to England to get care for her daughter. In the Netherlands, I spoke to people who went to Belgium. I've communicated with Australians who go to Cyprus regularly, Americans who go to Germany. This is nonsensical, it's expensive, and it's harmful to patients. Here in New York, I'm sure, and in many other states and countries, there are people who suffer the lingering effects of Lyme disease. They can get painkillers, they can get steroids and antidepressants, they can get lots of tests and diagnoses for other physical and psychiatric ailments. But they cannot get care for late stage, call it chronic Lyme disease, because they don't fit the model of Lyme disease in America. Now, ironically, that model accepts that 10 to 20% of patients remain ill for some period of time after they're treated for Lyme disease. They have joint and muscle pain, they have insomnia, memory problems, depression, numbness and tingling, and so on. That adds up, by the way, to 30 to 60,000 people a year who stay sick for a year or more after treatment. It's in the medical literature. The catch here, though, is the rulers of Lyme disease care in America maintain that those people no longer have Lyme disease. They say their short courses of antibiotics have killed the infection. Yes, they're sick. Maybe they have an autoimmune disease. Maybe they have inflammation from the original infection. Maybe they've got something else entirely. But no, they don't have Lyme disease. And so it's not our problem. So why does this happen? This goes back to the myths of Lyme disease. The first myth, number one myth, the test works. Now, the test for Lyme disease is something like asking a woman, are you a little bit pregnant? You either are or you're not. Not so much with Lyme disease. In one case I wrote about, a 16-year-old boy was put into a mental hospital for 7 weeks because of psychotic behavior. Now, major mental illness is a manifestation of Lyme disease. We know this. And he lived in a high Lyme area. So they gave him what we call the 2-tier or 2-part test for Lyme disease. He cleared the first test because he had a high load of antibodies. The problem was the second test, where they looked for evidence of specific antibodies. They found evidence of 4. He needed 5. He was as close as humanly possible to being positive for Lyme disease. He was ruled negative. I read 300 scientific papers for my book. I'm an English major, by the way. So that was a lot of science. I want to read to you what may be the single most gratifying sentence from all of them. 21 researchers looked at 78 different studies of Lyme disease tests. There have been a lot of studies on these tests. Here's what the group found. The data in this review do not provide sufficient evidence to make inferences about the value of the tests. Translated, we can't really say if the tests work when a doctor uses them on a patient. A pair of British researchers did a different analysis using a lot of the same studies. They concluded that 17% of late-stage Lyme disease patients tested negative when they were, in fact, positive. 17%. Then they compared that to HIV tests. The HIV test failed 0.1% of the time. That's a 170-fold difference. Now, we have known this about Lyme tests for years. We've known that the results vary by lab. We've known that in studies, they're all over the place in terms of reporting how well they work. But for years, they've been defended by the Centers for Disease Control, by the Infectious Diseases Society of America, the group that wrote the Lyme disease guidelines, by major medical journals. That official picture of certainty is being challenged in studies like the ones I just quoted, and by a task force that's re-examining how we manage this disease. It's meeting in Washington, D.C. But doctors still have no other choice, as they have since 1994, but to use the only approved test for Lyme disease. So here we are with, to put it mildly, a pretty tricky test. But instead of focusing on the people the test misses, American medicine has been preoccupied with the patients who are wrongly diagnosed with Lyme disease. That's the second myth, overdiagnosis. Since the early 1990s, I studied the literature. At least 30 scientific publications have been devoted to the overdiagnosis of Lyme disease, namely diagnosing someone who has Lyme disease who doesn't. The very first paper, which led to a lot of copycat science, found that more than half the tests that were positive in one laboratory were negative in another. Wow. But wouldn't that be a clue that the tests don't work? That labs don't know how to read them or process them, or doctors don't know how to use them? You might think. But instead, the takeaway for doctors after 30 papers repeated this was be suspicious of a positive test. Tread lightly. Don't falsely diagnose. This is part of that tamp it down mentality that's characterized this disease, that it's just Lyme anxiety. 15 months ago, my niece tested positive for Lyme disease. She had plenty of antibodies and enough of those markers. But no, her doctor said, false positive. He didn't treat her. He feared a false diagnosis in the face of a positive test. This is how Lyme disease dogma plays out every day. I told you that there were 30 papers on the overdiagnosis of Lyme disease. I found 5 that discussed underdiagnosis. This is a disease in which a missed diagnosis can be life-altering. It costs children months of childhood, years of schooling. But for years, a strange paradigm has ruled Lyme disease diagnosis. It goes like this. Okay, say the powers that be. The tests work, but not if you use them too early in the disease. The rash tells you you're infected them. The problem with that, you may not get the rash, you may not see it, you may not recognize it. It takes a lot of different forms. Okay, the powers that be say, the tests work, but they may show an old infection because antibodies hang out in your body for years. That's what my niece was told. Old infection, old antibodies, go home, you're not sick. Okay, the tests work, but you have to wait a while. Let the infection progress. Produce more antibodies, then we'll test later. This is one disease you don't let fester. It's not smart. It's not safe. The Lyme spirochete is very crafty. It's a corkscrew-shaped bacterium. It can drill through tough cartilage and tissue. It quickly leaves the bloodstream. It can sometimes go to the heart. It goes to the eyes. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. When it's under assault by our immune system or by antibiotics, it assumes different shapes. It covers itself with protective coatings. It hangs out there. When the coast is clear, then it strikes again. So I told you about Troy, the Connecticut boy. His parents had told an attending physician at the hospital that an outside doctor thought Troy might still be suffering from Lyme disease. Firmly and with great certainty, the hospital doctor said, "There is no such thing as chronic Lyme. These supposed Lyme experts are a dime a dozen. All they want is to take your money." I'd like to add something here. These supposed experts, as the hospital physician called them, are the doctors who are treating a patient population nobody wants. They're sometimes called quacks because they give longer-term antibiotics, mostly judiciously and mostly with probiotics. When was the last time your doctor said, take some probiotics with this amoxicillin prescription? In New York, virtually every one of them has at some point been investigated by the office that licenses doctors, the Office of Professional Medical Conduct. Why? Because they treated outside the guidelines for Lyme disease. Consider that antibiotics are among the safest drugs there are. They are used in long courses for things like TB, acne, urinary tract infection. Their overuse is a legitimate issue. But for some reason, a line has been drawn on Lyme disease, and it's based on outdated science that medicine has wrongly and fiercely clung to. This brings me to my third myth of Lyme disease. This myth holds that the infection can almost always be eradicated, that short courses of antibiotics kill the Lyme bug. In the past 5 years, about 20 scientific papers have questioned the ability of common antibiotics to eradicate Lyme disease. At major American universities, Northeastern, Tulane, UC Davis, Johns Hopkins, scientists have virtually done backflips in their efforts to kill this bug in test tubes, in mice, in monkeys. They've tried common antibiotics. They've tried them in different combinations. They've tried really tough, last-ditch antibiotics. Virtually every time, something called persister cells survived, namely a small number of Lyme disease bugs. These cells suggest why some patients may still suffer after treatment. Now, made in America Lyme dogma is not all wrong. It's just too pat. It's too black and white. Yes, some people are falsely diagnosed with Lyme disease. I'd add that I see little evidence of harm compared to those whose diagnoses are missed. And yes, many people do recover after a few weeks of doxycycline. These patients, though, they're the lucky ones. They were treated at a golden time. They are the Lyme disease patients around which the myths of this illness have been fashioned. The simple, straightforward, Lyme-only cases that doctors are willing to treat. The ones in which a rash makes a diagnosis and a bottle of pills cures. These, by the way, are also what we would call perfect positive patients. CDC positive, treated by the guidelines. It's in this group, these perfect patients, that the 10 to 20% stayed sick. What about the others who failed the test? A few years ago, a healthy man in Maryland suddenly became confused, delusional, incontinent. He was 76. So he was thought for weeks to have a form of quick onset dementia. Then a smart doctor thought to check for Lyme disease. The man was cured with antibiotics, but it made him wonder about other people like him. Would they, he asked, be put in some kind of facility and just waste away? Somewhere there are just such people. There was a 29-year-old man who lost his memory, began acting strangely, and was diagnosed for 10 years with schizophrenia. A team of doctors, researchers, decided to take another look. After 6 months on a strong antibiotic, intravenous antibiotic, the man got well. His problem wasn't schizophrenia, it was Lyme disease, and his cure was far outside the short courses suggested by the Lyme guidelines. Now, I would add here, and this is significant, antibiotics have their limits. They don't always or even often cure late-stage Lyme disease. They alone are not the answer. The problem is that medicine hasn't tried to figure out what does work. Rather, it denies a problem exists. And because we have a bad test, it lets infections get out of control and fester, which means it makes them much harder to treat. Sometimes medicine gets it wrong. When Teddy Roosevelt was a boy, his asthma was treated by putting him in a room filled with cigar smoke. That was common in the 1800s. Nobody thought that ulcers was caused by a bacteria until H. pylori was identified in 1982. Lo and behold, ulcers went away with antibiotics. The challenge faced by Lyme patients has no parallel in American medicine. I'm going to show you a series of slides from around the world. Across the nation, indeed the world, there's a huge patient population, just as here, that cannot get care. They meet in hundreds of Lyme disease support groups. They know the pain and the pitfalls of ticks. There's outrage and frustration among these people. I hope you're not one of them. But I also hope through my book, this is in New York City, a picture I took actually, to stoke a little bit of the outrage and the anger that these patients feel. Ticks are out there. They thrive in our warmer 21st century world, in our backyards, in our walks through the woods, in the places our children play. Children 5 to 14 are the most frequently infected group. So what can we do about this besides getting angry, as I am? Well, my advice may sound a little rudimentary. Stay away from tall weeds. Wear treated clothing that wards off ticks. Check yourself and your children after going outside. When flu-like symptoms show up in tick season, think Lyme disease and make sure your doctor does too. Inform yourself. But also, recognize that we had a hand in making this happen and that we've done little, too little, to stop it. We need to know this. We don't have this disease or this epidemic figured out. Thanks so much.
Mary Beth has said she'd be willing to take questions, and I'll turn the floor back over to her to field the questions. And if you need the microphone, let me know and I can bring it to you.
And my website address is up there if anybody wants any more information about the book, and that's my email address if you have questions.
What tests and how often would you suggest you get them? Question number one.
What test are you saying?
Right, and question number two, what spray, I recently sprayed with pyrethrin. Is that effective against it?
Permethrin, are you saying?
No.
Pyrethrin.
Put that on our post.
Yeah.
Pyrethrin.
I'm not an expert on what you should spray your garden with or your lawn or whatever. There's a page in the CDC website that lists a number of different, measures that you can take to put on your body, to put in your, on your property. But the long and short is we don't have really good controls right now over ticks. With mosquitoes, when there's an outbreak of Zika or West Nile, they can, spray whole neighborhoods and pretty quickly bring the mosquito population under control. But ticks live close to the ground. Half the time, most of the time, they're in hiding. There's long lapses between when they come out to feed. Because as I said, they feed only 3 times in their entire lives, and they live for 2 years. So most of the time, they're hidden. So it's a really difficult chore, and it's very expensive also to kill them, to find them and kill them. There are some things that are being tried in Dutchess County. There's something called the Tick Project that's using a fungicide or a fungal spray on properties, putting out these little bait boxes for mice. They go in, get a little tasty treat, and they get doused with some sort of chemical. But we have a ways to go to figure out how to control ticks in the environment.
And the other question was, what tests should we have and how often?
Well, there is no good, test for Lyme disease right now. The only test that has been approved for use and on which a doctor can diagnose someone with Lyme disease, or at least according to the IDSA guidelines that govern care, is that 2-tier test that I referred to. It's a very flawed test. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about this too, because just last week, a paper was published that more or less validated the criticisms that people have been making against the 2-tier test for the last 20 years. It says the test doesn't work, we need another test. So this is good. This is a really good development. There's about 25 authors on that paper. They're from the CDC, they're from the National Institutes of Health. They're some of the original researchers into Lyme disease, the people who put that first test into place and haven't allowed another one to take its place. But the next battle is going to be what takes its place, because the people who wrote that paper have vested interests in certain test technology. That's a whole nother issue, but there's a lot of conflicts of interest in this whole Lyme disease arena.
So getting back to your reference to Bill Gates, have you considered sending a copy of your book to Bill and Melinda Gates?
That's a really good idea. Should I send my book to Bill and Melinda Gates? Anybody who wants to do that, please. There are people who are trying to contact the Gates Foundation to get attention to Lyme disease. And I think that's a really good idea. What's keeping a lot of that research I referred to going, the stuff that is showing that common antibiotics may not be working, is actually funded by nonprofit organizations, pretty much run by or funded by rich people who have had Lyme disease in their families and who have suffered terribly and who think we don't have this figured out. And they have founded these organizations that raise money and fund research. But it's not enough. It's not anything on the scale of what we need. We need something like we did with AIDS. Because this is only going to get bigger. There's more ticks moving in, more different kinds of ticks. They're doing more nasty stuff. We've got this tick from the south is moving north, called the Lone Star tick. It has a little yellow badge on its back. It has shown up in Dutchess County. It's not common at all, but it's very common now on the eastern tip of Long Island. And this is a tick that lives in the Carolinas and in Georgia and loves hot steamy weather, and all of a sudden, it's moving north.
To amplify Mary Beth's point about the AIDS, HIV versus tick, 100 times the annual amount the government spends on ticks, it spends on AIDS every year. 100 times. 3 billion versus 30 billion. The private foundations are spending tens of millions a year, almost more than the government.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Where do the insurance companies figure in all this?
The insurance companies are a very big part of this problem because they will not pay for anything but other than what is prescribed in the Infectious Diseases Society of America guidelines. So they'll pay for 10 to 28 days of antibiotics for Lyme disease. And because we have a highly digitized electronic system now, doctors are really flagged if they go outside of those very strict rules about how to treat Lyme disease. We don't even have a diagnostic code for chronic Lyme disease or late-stage Lyme disease. We have Lyme disease and a couple of other things, but it's extremely closely controlled as to how Lyme disease is treated in America.
I had babesiosis, and went into Vassar Hospital for a week, and I'm fine. They cured that with antibiotics, it's the whole thing.
Yes.
And it worked.
Good. That's a really good outcome and a good story, and I like to hear it. I hear that kind of thing is missed probably, 5 or 10 times for every one that's caught, because doctors, first of all, shy away from Lyme disease because of that whole overdiagnosis thing and the fear of a false diagnosis and the way it's been minimized as being easy to diagnose and easy to treat. So that if you keep coming back and saying, I'm still sick after Lyme disease, they don't want to hear it often. And, you might not be sick just from Lyme disease. You might also have babesiosis, which is in local ticks. But there just has been this hesitation to really take on Lyme disease and tick-borne disease. Our medicine is somewhat of an art as well as a science. You have to figure it out.
The fact that I've had it, does that build up my immune system?
I can't say that. I know with Lyme disease you can get it again. So, no, you don't have any natural resistance to it. Rachel?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You get no resistance. You can get it over and over and over and over
Okay.
again.
Yeah.
And it's usually a different strain. So if it's not protected like a measles, mumps, whatever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a difficult disease to treat
Yeah.
and diagnose.
Why are doctors so afraid of a false positive result? Like, what is the risk involved in, having a false positive result, treating someone for Lyme disease, and they don't get better?
Well, they're basically not following those guidelines. There's something to be said about Lyme disease and the way it's been, set in stone as to how we treat it when compared to other diseases out there. It very early on became a really controversial disease. You had basically, it kind of emerged around the time of the internet, and you had people who would get treated according to those guidelines, or people who might not get treated because they didn't test positive, and they started to get very organized. And they started to show up at lectures by some of these famous doctors who wrote the Lyme disease guidelines. And they were kind of cast as this group of crazies. I actually got a 3,000 pages of emails from the Centers for Disease Control all about Lyme disease. And in one of them, a scientist was retiring from the NIH, and he wrote to this other scientist at the CDC, and he said, I'm going to miss all you guys, but one thing I'm not going to miss is the Lyme loonies. There's a lot of other examples of that. There was an article in the New York Times Magazine called "Stalking Dr. Steer." He's the guy who, invented Lyme disease. He discovered it. And he was portrayed as this mild-mannered physician who cared deeply about his patients and played the violin. And on the other hand, the Lyme patients, they were stalking him, they were mean, they were carrying signs. And that stuck. And it really hurt the cause, unfortunately. And today, the whole Lyme, advocacy movement is very savvy, it's very informed, it's science-based. They're not crazy. They want care.
Is there any place in the United States or a world where someone who has a disease to go for treatment can be trusted to look at this, look at the patient,
Yeah.
and say, we can or can't help you?
There is a whole list of places around the world and around the country where you can go, doctors you can go to, for complicated cases of tick-borne disease. But the solutions that they use, the protocols that they use vary a lot. You have, a lot of use of herbal supplements. You have dietary changes. You have, stay away from mold, get mold out of your house, detoxify heavy metal, get that out of your body. There's just, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, ozone therapy. I can't answer that. And the problem is we haven't tried to figure it out. So the patient is just left to their own devices, doing a lot of research, talking in, support groups, getting a lot of help. Some of them are, definitely helped by these treatments they seek. But there's really certainly no standard of care for them.
In an age where antibiotic resistance and medication adverse effects are becoming more common ground, how would you encourage healthcare professionals to treat people when the tests are coming back negative, especially when treating against the guidelines
Yeah.
is kind of frowned upon, not only by insurance companies, but just by people in general because of the
Yeah.
adverse effects?
Well, I think you certainly can make the argument that a short course of antibiotics is often given on suspicion of a sinus infection, for example, or a urinary infection, urinary tract, whatever. Doctors do this frequently. But, on the other hand, there have been studies that show that the Borrelia burgdorferi bug, the thing that causes Lyme disease, isn't prone to becoming a superbug because of being exposed to Lyme disease, to antibiotics. So that's not really an issue with this. There certainly is the issue that antibiotics do bad things to your gut. We really ought to minimize our use of antibiotics. But they've done a couple of very, very minor reports about adverse effects of long-term intravenous antibiotic treatment. Like really just a half dozen individual cases, nothing systematic. And they've used that to say, this is harmful for Lyme disease patients. Well, intravenous antibiotics are used widely for a lot of things, and yes, they're harmful in other cases too. But the harm in these cases has been so magnified out of proportion to what it really is.
This is not science, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I just wanted to ask, since you are an investigator and you've been doing this for such a long time, have you looked into New York State and what, at one point I know they had a Lyme committee, either through the Senate or through, the House, what they're doing? Is there anything that's helping the medical field or supporting it? Now it's so relevant.
Yeah. Well, New York has done some good work. We have some good legislators like Sue Serino and Dee Dee Barrett working on it. We did adopt a doctor protection law so that physicians need not fear the Office of Professional Medical Conduct solely because of the way they treat Lyme disease. it hasn't helped a great deal because we haven't seen other doctors step up to the plate. They're still afraid of treating outside of the guidelines.
It's kept them in practice. Many of them will go to retirement if you hadn't gotten that law passed.
It has kept them.
It kept those doctors that do in practice, many of them will quit their practice.
Yes. What we want is we want more doctors to come into the fold. There's also a bill pending to cover insurance for Lyme patients. There's another one to declare ticks an invasive species, which would open up a whole bunch of funding possibilities. So those are some good things that are happening. Maybe one or two others? Yeah.
So 20 years ago, I was in Australia, and I came back, and I had flu-like symptoms. I had flu-like symptoms after I got back from Australia, and they said it was the flu. Then they misdiagnosed me for 6 years, and I saw 32 doctors until I found my core 4, and only 2 of them are from Dutchess County. And you were the only person that has told me that there is ticks and Lyme disease in Australia. So I thank you very, very much.
Well, Lyme disease is denied by the Australian authorities, by the way. There is something in the ticks, but
Yeah.
they haven't yet identified it, and they don't call it Lyme. Lyme is just, it's one of those words, like I said.
And the one thing I do say to people when they say to me about antibiotics, how much can you put through your body? It's not safe. I say to them, I would put what I have put my body through in the last 20 years, I would do 6 months of IV antibiotics in a heartbeat because it's not healthy what has, happened with testing, biopsies. I have a port now for my IVIG, which is actually very helpful, but when we talk about expenses, it's $24,000 a month.
Wow. Wow.
Wow.
One more. Shailene.
Climate change. Do you think that the linking of climate change with Lyme disease will help bolster support to put more money and more research, et cetera, into the...
Well, my idea in linking it to Lyme, to climate change, was to bring in people who care about the world, who care about the earth, and maybe alert them that there's something else that is happening as a result of climate change. So, I hope it strikes a chord with some people who might not otherwise know of the risks of ticks. We need to get the message out to people who don't already, haven't already had that awful experience of not being able to get diagnosed and having it, fester and so forth. Rachel, you're last. Yes.
I facilitate a sports
Okay.
support group for Lyme. We're in our 30-some year. We meet Pleasant Valley on the second Wednesday of every month. I invite anybody to come out and join us. I have some literature out on the desk. One is a very thick copy that you can download from the internet, How to Protect Your Property from Lyme disease. And also there's one copy of the tick study in Millville. But I also brought our tick check carry with us, which we usually use for children. But it's also good for adults and homeowners. I think there's one dog with us today. So that you can feel what these ticks look like, feel like, so that you can help to identify them yourself, your children, and your pets. I love the back of the table. And Mary Beth.
Thank you very much. I want to remind you that Mary Beth's book is for sale outside the theater. There are refreshments being served at the lounge to the left. I want to thank Dr. John Knight for coordinating this and the whole lecture series this fall. I think it's actually quite excellent. And I imagine that Mary Beth, your college sweatshirt has probably worn out, so I think you deserve a new one.